the architecture of Olden time. Much of a current scholarly noise around 18th century antiquarianism, and there is some, you might not think it, but there is, relates to academics' interest in the Gothic. And being cynical, this is partly a product of a drive by funding councils to encourage interdisciplinarity, because Gothic is, of course, inherently interdisciplinary. It can be approached from the perspectives of literary history, architectural history, art history, as well as antiquarianism. But that aside, I mean, the Gothic clearly is extremely important for 18th century antiquaries. It was one of their major areas of research. And they were certainly very busy recovering Gothic antiquities of various descriptions, working out the principles of Gothic architecture, investigating the origins of the pointed arch, developing a taxonomy of style that Rickman would later standardize, and celebrating the historical and aesthetic value of the Gothic, whether ruined or still intact. Over the course of a century, the meaning of Gothic, as applies to architecture, ceased to be pejorative and was used with increasing discrimination, particularly as applied to ecclesiastical structures. But these 18th century antiquaries displayed very little interest at all in the traditions of domestic or vernacular architecture. When noted at all, it was generally dismissed as old and dark and associated with irregular streets and overhanging projections that 18th century urban improvers sought to eliminate in the cause of freer flowing air, freer flowing traffic, and the creation of prospect views. But by the 1830s, such buildings were starting to attract much more positive evaluations from both antiquaries and architects. So the architects in my title, we've had to wait quite a long time for them, but they're arriving today. So it's beginning to attract more attention from the architects and the antiquaries. And it's this development and its importance in generating the idea of a historic town that I want to look at in more detail in this lecture. I'm going to suggest that there were three main shifts in values and approaches to the past that helped to bring this about. Changes that we've already seen in operation in other contexts. They happened concurrently rather than sequentially. Firstly is the historic value of such buildings. Like the city walls, they were associated with a concept called Olden time, which was assumed to be particularly formative in national history. Secondly, and closely related, we find an emphasis not just on the public buildings, which had always traditionally featured in descriptions of towns, the churches, the guild halls, the theatres, but on domestic architecture, reflecting the 19th century fascination with domesticity in both its modern and historical incarnations that we've already encountered in the context of the Romans and the Saxons. Finally, we need to acknowledge the transformation of the aesthetic value of vernacular or domestic architecture, following in the picturesque tradition of topographical artists, whereby the medieval and the early modern townscape was reconceived as picturesque and attractive, rather than ugly, backward, and insanitary. But first of all, I want to look a bit more closely at the idea of Olden time itself. Of course, those of you who were tough enough to come along yesterday will remember that we encountered it in the context of the city walls. And city walls were particularly effective in evoking its memory. And as a term, it tended to have fairly specific architectural connotations. And indeed, it probably still conjures up a particular style of building amongst most people. Half-timbered, gabled, the lead-paned casement windows, and the projecting upper stories. The kind of features that would later be replicated in bastardized form as Tudor beefon across the country. But the term Olden time was very much a 19th century invention and was central to the Victorians' romantic engagement with the past, and never, to my knowledge, used in the 18th century. In the 1830s and 1840s, there's a huge subgenre of publications devoted to particular places: Windsor, Worcester, Preston, Carlisle, Canterbury, London, or indeed Edinburgh, in the Olden time. And to prove my point, here's a Google engram. For those of you who haven't never had the pleasure of playing around with this, what Google does is search for all the books that have been digitized and identifies the frequency with which terms are cited. And obviously there are problems in using this when it's simply indicative of what Google has digitized. But the results are suggestive. So we can see that there's an initial peak in the 1830s, and then there's another peak towards the end of the 1850s, and then after 1860 it's in decline. So Olden time is of particular significance between the period 1820 and 1860. And this non-specific Olden time was also often acquainted with another term called Merry England. And again, as you can see from this engram, Merry England was deployed with not quite the same frequency as Olden time initially, but becomes more significant later in the 19th and the 20th century. I think reasons for that are quite interesting, and I think partly there's a sort of interwar revival, which I think is closely related to movements like the whole historical pageant movement in the 1830s, and then I think the accession of Queen Elizabeth II and all the interest around that probably may account for that peak in the circa 1950. But the point is that there's a lot of noise around Merry England coinciding with Olden time. And it's this comparable pattern to the Olden time. So when and where was Merry England, or indeed Olden time, or as we occasionally find, Merry Old England? In Pugin's Contrast, or Collard's Past and Present, and the novels of the Young Englanders, Olden time was identified very closely with the medieval period, before the Reformation. The customs, traditions, and social harmony of medieval rural society were represented as a critique of modern urban and industrial society, and represented as a potential source of social renewal. So Olden time and Merry England were very often idealised from the 1830s onwards as an era of particularly harmonious social relations and as a kind of crucible of English values and characteristics, typically infused with a very strong dose of nostalgia and patriotism. And whilst the influence of contrasts or Sybil or past and present can't be denied, equally, as historians such as Peter Mandel have shown, there's also another version of Olden time and Merry England, which is particularly articulated in the popular press through publications like the Penny Magazine or the Mirror, or indeed through the historical novels of people like Harrison Ainsworth. This was rooted in the 16th century, when Protestantism, English liberties, social harmony, and urban prosperity prevailed. And this periodization, not surprisingly, finds resonance with many urban historians. Thus, James Thompson, for example, who wrote on Leicester in 1844, waxed lyrical over the gabled dwellings of olden times, which he associated with cheerfulness and kindliness. They speak, he wrote, of a simpler but not less happy day than the present, when townsfolk were knit together by the bonds of a social fellowship and delighted in gay sport and frequent holidays. A time when, by implication, sordid profit and the spirit of mammon had yet to poison social relations. In fact, the periodization of olden time in the urban context was generally very highly indeterminate, making it impossible to align these sorts of publication consistently with either a Puginesque celebration of pre-Reformation society or a more Protestant version of Elizabethan prosperity. Indeed, the olden times could range from the Romans to the reign of Queen Anne, or later, already even up to the end of the 18th century. For obvious reasons of building survival, however, historians tended to focus on a period between the late 15th century to the 17th century. As we saw yesterday in architectural terms, the onset of greater internal stability after the end of the Wars of the Roses was associated by many writers with the declining power of the feudal nobility and greater commercial prosperity. This, it was argued, allowed for the emergence of a different style of domestic architecture that emphasised comfort and hospitality over defensive capacity, just as it had led to the abandonment of fortified cities. For this reason, The most familiar depictions of olden time tend to be dominated by mansions and country houses, such as those celebrated by Nash in his Mansions of England in Olden Time, and in a steady stream of publications from the 1830s onwards, which documented the domestic architecture of the late 15th century and the Tudor era. This has led to a tendency amongst architectural historians to consider interest in this kind of architecture almost exclusively in terms of a country house. And we have Penshurst from Kent in this illustration from Nash here. But although many of the most familiar evocations of olden time located it in a rural setting of noble hospitality or traditional village customs, it was certainly not a concept from which towns and urban society were excluded. And indeed, the narrative of increasing domestic harmony, commercial expansion, and growing liberty gave towns an essential role to play. And actually, among the architects and the antiquaries of the 19th century, there was a recognition of a distinctive style of street architecture and of municipal or civic architecture that particularly flourished in the 16th century, as towns became more prosperous and more confident in their local economy and their political rights. Thus, Charles Knight, the great popularizer of history antiquities of the 1830s and 40s, summarised the main historical epochs as the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the feudal age, the age of palaces and mansions, adding that to this age belongs also the monuments of civic power, the halls of guilds and companies. Olden times and Merry England were also particularly associated in the 19th century mind with the activities of pageantry and feasting, such as the mumming that we have here in the interior of Penshurst. And this was a favourite subject of historical painters, historical novelists, and these kinds of activities were regularly recreated for the purposes of entertainment. But again, given the vagueness which surrounded the usage of olden time and Merry England, these were ideas that could be equally associated with the good cheer and hospitality of inns, the traditions of civic feasting, the pageantry of the mystery plays and of guilds and corporations, even into the 18th century. Nostalgic evocations of former displays of civic pageantry can be traced back to the early 19th century in some cases. So in somewhere like Great Yarmouth, we find deliberate revivals of events like the Water Frolic in the early 19th century. But after the Municipal Reform Act of 1835, there's a clear dividing line between an unreformed era of private influence, patronage, and corrupt expenditure, and a modern era of probity, public spirit, and accountability, or at least that was a theory. And this actually stimulates much more interest in these kinds of traditions of civic pageantry and feasting, and so customs which persisted into the 19th century, even though comparatively recent, could be associated with this idea of olden time. And in Leicester, as in many other boroughs, the civic regalia was sold off and all the ceremonies banished after 1835 on the grounds that the true dignity of a mayoralty doesn't exist in antiquated pageantry. So we have this tendency to conflate the image of self-indulgent corporate feasts of the pre-reform era with a more generalised image of olden time or good old times. The guilds and corporations themselves became, if you like, historical artefacts. And here we have the Guildhall from Nutter's Carlisle Inn, the olden time, published, as you can see, 1835, quite a significant date, and significantly too, in his olden time, they're dressed in 18th century dress. So this is an example of how the 18th century has become olden time within quite a short period. So the guilds, pageantry, civic pageantry, this is all becoming historicised. And the urban historians of the early 19th century are beginning to start to treat the trading companies as historical material. They colour with the richest hues the times in which they flourished. They rendered the olden times particularly picturesque. The Shearman's Hall in Shrewsbury, wrote one commentator, conveyed much of a character of the city halls of other days, could be associated with good cheer, inspiring feasts, and the social merriment of brethren in the olden time. St Mary's Hall, Coventry, was a scene of feasting and wassailry, visitors were told, and the size of the kitchens indicated the liberal scale of guild entertainments. In King's Lynn, the town hall, formerly the hall of a Trinity Guild, was reconfigured as both the locus of corporate authority and of corporate conviviality. Visitors were directed to the prison cells, converted from the cellars, and were told how the good things prepared for a festive board had once been stored, while at St George's Hall they were encouraged to imagine a time when the banner of St George had given dignity to feasting and the sound of minstrelsy. But to return to the actual descriptions of buildings, before looking at particular towns, it's worth noting that the majority of publications on domestic or Elizabethan architecture, which were being produced by the antiquarian-minded architects of the day, always included examples of half-timbered buildings drawn from towns, as well as these better-known representations of noble and gentry seats. And as John Britton pointed out on the rise and progress of domestic architecture, numerous examples of timber buildings remain in different parts of England, but of this class, the greater part are to be found in old cities and towns, where stone and brick were rare or were not brought into general use. In Exeter, Salisbury, Bristol, Chester, Hereford, Coventry, Ipswich, Manchester and several other towns where modern improvements and uniform rows of building have not wholly superseded old plans and old uncomfortableness, many of these houses are still preserved. Similarly, illustrations of specifically domestic architecture produced by draftsmen such as A.C. Pugin, for example, included urban examples. So Pugin's, this is A.C. Pugin, so the father of the better known one, his specimens of Gothic architecture, 1826, included examples from buildings such as Crosby Hall, and his series of, in London, his series of ornamental timber gables drew chiefly on Coventry. Happerson's ancient half-timbered houses of England included examples from Tewkesbury, Hereford, Hull, Coventry, I could go on, Buckton Lamb, studies of ancient domestic architecture, Lincoln and Peterborough. I won't bore you, but you get the idea. And in a different kind of publication, John Britton's picturesque antiquities of English cities had gone far beyond the focus upon mansion houses or ecclesiastical architecture that had dominated many of his earlier publications, to include the more quotidian structures of urban life, collectively known as street scenery, that is, gatehouses, inns, market crosses, toll houses, guild halls, almshouses, and ordinary domestic dwellings. All found their place because they were, as Britton emphasised, illustrative of man in his domestic economy and historical relations. Now, Picturesque Antiquities of English Cities wasn't Britton's most successful publication, but that's not so much because the subject lacked interest, but because the copperplate engravings with which it was illustrated had already become outpriced by the emergence, or rather not outpriced, undercut by the emergence of the newer and cheaper steel engravings. But this Picturesque Antiquities of English Cities is an important text in actually setting down a marker of this idea of the city itself being picturesque rather than a particular building. In addition to the proliferation of buildings dealing with domestic and vernacular architecture on a national scale, we also need to remember that there was a growing body of provincial artists who followed in the footsteps of antiquarian topographical artists such as Turner, Carter, Girtin and Hearn of the late 18th century, who had depicted the picturesque antiquities of respective localities, and these artists produced etchings, engravings and watercolours in sometimes bewildering profusion. And I think it's quite interesting. I don't think the importance of the sort of urban picturesque for the topographic art of the early 19th century has really been fully appreciated. In York, there's Joseph Halfpenny and Henry Cave. In Chester, George Curt and Samuel Prout. In Bristol, Joseph Skelton. In Leicester, Jonathan Flower. In Carlisle, Matthew Ellis Nutter. And in Norfolk, the artists of the Norwich School, including Ninham, Cotman, Sillett and others. These are all producing a very rich corpus of artistic production of the remnants of antiquity of the towns and their localities. And these were used to illustrate guides and histories. And so a visual resource is being created throughout the provincial Britain, through which the domestic architecture of provincial towns was being illustrated. And unlike the detached images of architectural pattern books, which dissected and analysed in their component parts the principles of architecture, these town guides and histories, which were developing the idea of a historic town, tended to select those images which focused on street scenes, such as we have here, that depicted the half-timbered houses as inhabited buildings, a part of daily life, and adapted to the needs of urban society. And Britain's term street scenery is very significant here, as it is indicative of this trend towards conceptualising the town as an ensemble of buildings, the picturesque quality and interest of which was cumulative, rather than single, isolated structures which were deemed worthy of note. And what might be missing in terms of forensic architectural analysis was compensated for through quotidian verisimilitude. The proximity of text and image offered by the increasing availability of cheap illustrations compensated for the lack of proficiency in architectural description of many of the writers of guidebooks. So rather than detailing what was of interest about a given building, the reader could simply be told it was an interesting specimen of the architecture of olden time, and the image itself could provide an immediate and correspondingly powerful apprehension of history and of times past. Inevitably, certain towns became particularly associated with domestic architecture in the generalising narratives of these antiquaries and topographers. And the category of ancient town, or sometimes good old town, began to be used to indicate the presence not just of city walls or a cathedral, but of this particular type of domestic vernacular architecture. Britain, as we saw, singled out Exeter, Salisbury, Bristol, Chester, Hereford, Coventry, Ipswich, Manchester. Others included Shrewsbury, some cited Saffron Walden, others Norwich. It depends on the writer, but there's a kind of core of towns which generally got cited, which included Chester, York, Norwich, Coventry, Shrewsbury, and Bristol. Manchester did feature quite frequently, and this was before the Market Improvement Act had pulled down the core. Any of you who, like me, read Harrison Ainsworth will remember the Manchester Rebels, where Harrison Ainsworth creates a very convincing evocation of Manchester in the olden time. The attention of antiquaries, as we shall see, was not necessarily sufficient to generate a corresponding shift in the representation of the towns themselves, because, of course, the simple fact that John Britton or Thomas Wright or Daniel Wilson in Edinburgh drew attention to particular features of vernacular architecture didn't necessarily mean that everybody in the town immediately responded by appreciation of these buildings. But with the advent of railway travel, it's almost every town you look at is quite clear there was an effort to start identifying this kind of architecture. So Gloucester, for example, in a guide published in 1829, these buildings are completely invisible. But by 1848, after the arrival of the railway, the Stranger's Guide is alerting the visitor to the richness of a town's association with the golden past and the relics of olden time. And this might have been in response to the visit of the British Archaeological Association, where the members had actually been quite rude about the Gloucestrians' lack of appreciation for the historic environment of their town. And John Britton, in particular, had berated them for their neglect of... New Inn. That's New Inn, not just Inn. Somehow the captions got cut off. Anyway, and so I suspect that the author of A Stranger's Guide had probably been at the public lecture that John Britton had given, because there's quite a close similarity, and in detailing the architectural ornament of the New Inn and the Ram Inn. It didn't stop the New Inn being pulled down later, however. The shift in representation between the 18th and the 19th century can be better illustrated through some other examples, and I'm going to focus now on a couple of other towns. Firstly, Shrewsbury. And this was a town which acquired increasing renown in the 19th century for the quality of its street scenery and domestic architecture, and its ambience as a 16th century town. This is in contrast to the 18th century, where it was any guide in history dwelt very much upon its Georgian refinements and its genteel pretensions. In 1808, Hugh Owen had published an account of the ancient and present state of Shrewsbury, and here he complained that the interior of the town didn't correspond to its delightful exterior appearance that you could see in the prospect view. It had irregular streets which were badly paved, and old-style houses were mixed up with new ones, and it stood in need of a well-considered plan of general and progressive improvement. Even in 1825, the two-volume history by Blakeway and Owen paid very little attention to the architectural legacy of the 16th century. Neither Owen nor Blakeway was seriously interested in such architectural antiquities. But they had gone to the trouble of employing very good artists to provide illustrations, including, amongst others, John Buckler. And amongst the plates, there were a number that depicted the half-timbered houses, such as this one by Buckler of Butcher Row. These were totally divorced from the text, and the authors rather disarmingly admitted in the preface that the engravings had been placed almost entirely at random. At best, the connection resided simply in the fact that the building depicted had a vague relationship to an individual whose life was being discussed in the text, but beyond that, there's no correlation. But the fact that these plates are being included is indicative of this reorientation in taste. This is confirmed in 1829. Gentleman's Magazine, there was a long article on an ancient mansion at Shrewsbury that had just been taken down, a half-timbered house on Wild Cop. By the 1840s, the guidebooks are pointing out and illustrating the characteristic features of 16th century architecture, such as the projecting bay windows, the fanciful carving of the barge boards, and the plaster mouldings on the facades. And buildings which had never featured in earlier accounts were now meriting illustration and description because of their distinctive black and white architecture, including, for example, Butcher Row and the houses on Pride Hill. Other structures which had formerly only been mentioned in passing were awarded much greater importance because of their architectural style and their Elizabethan associations. Thus, the town hall and the glories internal and external of a 17th century grammar school, which was now being celebrated for having included amongst its alumni students such as Sir Philip Sidney, the archetypal embodiment for Victorians of Elizabethan chivalry. And the extent to which Shrewsbury actively embraced its association with olden time is reflected in the fact that even the new railway station was built in mock Tudor by Penson Jr. of Chester. And this is in 1848, and it's a style that echoes that of a grammar school, to which it's effectively standing opposite. Those of you who know Shrewsbury, there's a little bit of a walk between the station and the grammar school, but certainly in 1848, it would have been a clear sight line between the two, and you could have compared the styles. With the advent of rail travel and the increasing numbers of domestic stories, Shrewsbury's 16th century associations were further reinforced by the emphasis that was placed upon its Shakespearean associations. No other town, it was argued, could claim connections with so many of Shakespeare's characters. It would appear that Shrewsbury belonged in an especial manner to Shakespeare, said Bentley's Miscellany. Prince Henry, Glendower, Hotspur, and Falstaff are continually called to mind in his works. I think if you'd cut out Henry IV parts 1 and 2, you'd have been pushed to find any Shakespearean connections. But anyway, Stratford was not the only town to capitalise upon the Victorian passion for Shakespeare. And Coventry too benefited indirectly from the Victorian passion for literary tourism, being close not only to Stratford but also Kenilworth and the romance of Scott's novels. However, it was also acquiring a particularly notable reputation as an exemplar of the architecture of olden time. In the 1790s, antiquaries such as John Carter and Richard Gough had drawn particular attention to aspects of the town's 15th and 16th century fabric. But for all their interest in its Gothic architecture, it was really focused on the churches and the former monastic buildings, and neither Gough nor Carter nor Thomas Sharp, a local antiquary, had any sensibility really for the domestic and the vernacular architecture that would become so important. Pugin, as I've mentioned, used a lot of studies from Coventry for his ornamental timber gables, published in 1831, riveting read. He highlights the ornate intricacy to be found in the half-timbered architecture and really identified Coventry with this particular style. But it was the historical guides published from the 1840s and publications such as the Penny Magazine, from which this illustration is taken, that really began to confirm Coventry's reputation as an olden time city. And the Penny Magazine ran for 13 years, and most months it featured an article on a different city or different town. But Coventry is the only one in the entire series which was presented as ancient Coventry and was purely historical. Every other account of towns gave a description of the present as well as the ancient state. But the Penny Magazine bills it as ancient Coventry. William Hickling, the author of A History Come Guide, published in 1846, observed that the fact that Coventry had been fortunate enough to avoid destruction by fire for the past 300 years, unlike so many other towns, meant that the timber and plaster houses of the old town had survived unscathed. And it's also the case that, as well as escaping fire, Coventry in the 18th century hadn't enjoyed great prosperity, and unlike many other 18th century towns, had therefore undergone little of a classicising embellishment associated with what historians often call the 18th century urban renaissance. So Hickling was able to inform his readers that Coventry presents the aspect of a city in the 16th century. And this is a very far cry from the guide published only 22 years earlier, the Coventry Guide, which had bemoaned the absence of any major conflagration in Coventry that might have removed some of the prominent inconveniences in the city, as it had in neighbouring Warwick. So, quite a big shift in sentiment. And so rather than simply condemning the streets as unhygienic and dark and narrow, Hickling is emphasising this sort of opportunity for immersing oneself in a 16th century environment. And rather than simply criticising this kind of architecture for its insanitary and unhealthy and unpleasant environment, he's explaining it in terms of the prevailing manners and customs of a time. So he explained that in the 16th century, builders would not have been aware of the importance of the free circulation of air. Where he got that idea from, I think he just made it up. But the point is that he's trying to historicise and explain this different kind of architecture and to understand it as a historical phenomenon. And the narrowness of the streets, he explained, was because of the fact that carriages were so rare at this period. So the advantages of wide streets weren't apparent. So a person imbued with taste must derive true pleasure from the perambulation of this city, was his conclusion. And his history is well illustrated with very detailed descriptions of the 15th and 16th century structures. And as well as the exterior, he's also describing the interior. And again, this is another new development of the 1830s and 1840s, an interest in actually describing the interior decor and arrangements of these examples of domestic vernacular architecture, particularly where there's good ornamental carving around the fireplace and the elaborate plasterwork, which is so typical of 16th century. So it's interesting in itself as an example of the history of domesticity, but for Hickling, it was also proof of the town's former prosperity as a centre of commerce and manufacturing in the 16th century. So for all his emphasis on Coventry in the olden time, he's still able to exploit that to narrate a sort of bigger narrative about Coventry's continued historical importance as a centre of manufacturing, and in the present he's able to provide a kind of historical precedent for his arguments for Coventry's commercial and manufacturing importance in the 19th century. It's not simply retrospective nostalgia. Edinburgh, Old Town, of course, was another famous location for the evocation of olden time. Henry Littlejohn observed in his report on the sanitary condition of Edinburgh in 1865, there are few cities in the empire which are subjected to a more searching examination by tourists. However, his elaboration of this observation was less positive, as there are still fewer in which the objects of chief interest are the dirtiest and most squalid districts. Our closes are objects of historical interest and are every year closely inspected by thousands of strangers. But wherever you have a dense population of the poorest class, it is impossible, under the best sanitary regulations, to effect a great amount of cleanliness. As Littlejohn implied, Edinburgh's visitors were rather more interested in the historical than the sanitary. They were searching out the picturesque features of Edinburgh's old town, and particularly those which had been rendered celebrated through historical or literary association and through novels such as The Heart of Midlothian. Speaking as I am here in the Museum of Scotland in front of so many people who are experts on the history of Edinburgh, I probably should stop now. But I think there are a few points, more general points, that it's worth drawing out about Edinburgh's old town and olden time in comparison with the English examples. And Edinburgh, I think, is unique in interesting ways. One of the most important reasons is that there was such a significant displacement of a population from one part of the city to another. By the 19th century, by the 1830s and 40s, a large element of polite society, the wealthy and the genteel, as readers and visitors were always reminded, had migrated from the old town to the new, leaving the old town almost as a fossil, as a kind of record of the manners and customs of an earlier age. Robert Chambers put it well: in some of the sequestered closes and back courts of the old town, there may at this very day be found specimens of people bearing nearly all the characteristics of the 17th century. And the architecture, of course, was expressive of these manners and mores. Secondly, the surviving architecture of olden time, that is from the late 15th century, when Edinburgh began to grow rapidly as a capital city, to the 17th century, when it had undergone the Protestant Reformation, represented what for the 19th century was unequivocally the most important period of Scotland's history. There may not have been recourse to a concept of Merry Scotland, seems somewhat unlikely under Presbyterian rule, but the Scottish version of olden time was equally formative for the Scottish nation, as was that of olden time and Merry England for the South Britons. Therefore, the historical value of these buildings was equally incontestable. Thirdly was the fact that picturesque taste, undoubtedly encouraged by the novelistic influence of Scott and others, meant that the qualities of old town that Littlejohn and others so vehemently decried were becoming much more attractive. I think this shift in taste was probably a little later than some English cities, certainly even as late as 1829 in modern Athens. It was complained of John Knox's house that this ancient building is in no respect to be admired on account of its architectural peculiarities, which, if they belong to any definable order or species, must be arranged with those which no person of taste or judgment can approve. Nonetheless, there are other publications, such as Chambers' Traditions of Edinburgh, where there's rather more appreciation. The Traditions of Edinburgh is more about the inhabitants, but the text is beginning a process of identification of some of the more notable examples of domestic architecture, albeit not terribly nuanced or sophisticated. So Lord President Fenton-Barnes' house is singled out for a mark as being the only ancient wooden-fronted fabric still standing on the south side of a high street. Chambers also extended an appreciative eye towards streets such as West Bow, less subject than most of the other streets to renovation. Its form, he suggested, much the same as it had been 200 years ago. His minor antiquities of 1833 offered more detail and sketched out 3 different stages of burgle or street architecture. And he starts becoming much more enthusiastic about decayed houses and projecting gables with their air of imminent collapse. But he's really more interested in the sort of folklore and the tales of wizards and ghosts. And there's not a lot of precise analysis of the kind that we're finding in a lot of the publications south of the border. Really, it's not until Wilson's Memorials of Edinburgh in the Olden Time of 1848 that we get this really detailed analysis. And Wilson, of course, is another of these artists turned antiquaries, and he starts life as an engraver. And he explains in his preface that the volume had actually originated in the sketches that he had taken in his youth of antiquities that were in danger of disappearing or had in fact already disappeared. And so his sensibility and awareness of this kind of architecture was stimulated by the imminent threat to these structures and his awareness of the change around him. Going back to my point about the fluidity of Olden time, Wilson's version definitely included the 18th century as well as the more unexceptionable 16th and 17th century. Edinburgh, as he explained, couldn't be accommodated within an Anglo-centric model of olden time architecture. There wasn't the same tradition of wooden plaster, barge boards, ornamental carving. But he traces out an Edinburgh version, if you like, and he is beginning to redress this lacuna in the literature on domestic antiquities in Scotland. And like Chambers, he lamented the loss of many of the ancient timber-framed fronted tenements and other picturesque features such as the Luccan booths around St Giles. And he provides some really arresting images, such as the typical features of the stone ground flats, which are surmounted with a second story of wood, which were generally approached by an outside stair. And he just compares these kinds of additions as the clusters of swallows' nests that gather around the parent building as the offshoots of a family increase. A rather lovely image, I think, but it also is indicative of this much more sympathetic appreciation of this type of architecture and this willingness to see the positive, picturesque and aesthetic qualities associated with it. But really you have to wait until 1856 when Robert Chambers read his lectures on the ancient domestic architecture of Edinburgh to the Archaeological Institute. But Old Town's picturesque reputation notwithstanding, nowhere became more celebrated for its domestic architecture than Chester, and it's worth pursuing the example of Chester in greater depth now, as it illustrates very clearly how the representation of a town evolved in response to the expectations of visitors and tourists. We've already seen how the unique circuit of the city walls provided a point of communion with the past, but within the walls it was the half-timbered buildings of Chester's Rows that really constituted the Chester experience, as we might call it now. And this was the showpiece, the Rows, the East Gate, the North Gate, the Watergate and Bridge Street. And the Rows is a system of timber walkways projecting from the first floor of houses, which create a kind of covered portico underneath. These had always attracted attention. Celia Fiennes, always an enthusiast for the new, was very critical of them as being dark and gloomy and really very impractical. Defoe, similarly, thought they were old and ugly, dark, dirty and uneven. Stukely, you may remember, he has a less of commercial eye and he's very excited because he thinks that they're actually a perpetuation of Roman stone-built porticos. This interpretation actually lingers on well into the 19th century and continues to have an influence on descriptions of Chester even into the second half of the 19th century. But more importantly, what happens in the 19th century is that rather than being an example of the city's claims to Roman antiquity, they become celebrated as a place where you can actually encounter the past. And all the complaints about their irregularity and their darkness are gradually forgotten, and they become celebrated as this unique form. Joseph Hemingway, publisher of many of the guides and histories of the 1830s and 40s, highlighted their distinctiveness and the intrinsic interest that derive from their age and the construction method. And he did allow that there were some inconveniences, but he emphasised again their importance to any lover of antiquity. By the 1850s, we're very rarely finding even a note of criticism. And the rows by this time have been very widely celebrated by local artists such as Pickering and Kewitt and Prout, and there are so many illustrations of them. And they've become extremely famous. And by this time also, I think a crucial point is that the Americans are arriving in Chester in increasing numbers. By this time, there's a regular steam service from America which arrives at Liverpool. And the first thing that many American visitors do is get the train from Liverpool to Chester, because this provides them with a kind of immediate immersion into olden time, the country that their forebears had left behind. They can almost sort of insert themselves back into the 16th century when the first emigrants had left England for America. And Chester also appears to them as the illustration of the literary evocations of the past that they'd been reading back in America in the novels of Scott and Ainsworth and even Dickens. So Mrs. Caroline Kirkland, for example, was enchanted with the quaint features of the city, the houses which leaned over the pathways, the windows of all shapes and sizes, and a general air of a world forgetting by the world forgot. So she obviously read her Pope as well. And fresh from the hustle and bustle of New York, she found all this entrancing, and she gets very excited because the inns, she thinks, are exactly as they're described by Dickens. And it's not just the aesthetic, though. She is embracing it as a kind of lifestyle. She sees this as being symbolic of an older and freer, more natural times. And it offers an opportunity of imagining a different kind of living, a more communal space in which was the antithesis of the exclusiveness and rigidly enforced privacy of what she understood modern private life to be. So Chester's offering not just tangible relics of olden time, but this sort of almost this complete sensory experience of the past. It breathes of feudal times and is enveloped in associations of romance and poetry, wrote another. It was coming to somewhere where the old and buried past was brought to life. It's a place of historical romance where people could be transported back into history. I mean, most Chesterians probably entertained a less romantic vision of their time than Mrs. Kirkland. They probably would have bridled somewhat at the way in which she described not just the buildings, but the inhabitants as quaint. But her celebration of Chester's picturesque historical charm was rapidly taken up by local newspapers, such as the Chester Courant, which published a very lengthy extract, and this in turn was reproduced in Thomas Hughes' Stranger's Guide to Chester, from which the illustration comes. Nor was Kirkland's the only enthusiastic endorsement which Hughes drew upon. There's another novelist, an English novelist, Albert Smith, was similarly waxing lyrical about what he called the rare old city of Chester, in the strangely titled Struggles and Adventures of Christopher Tadpole. It's not worth reading for anything except the description of Chester, where he delights in the old black beams and the uneven gables, the quaint supports, the discoloured glass, quivering and blinking in the rickety casements, the overflanging floors and the rude uneven steps of the pavement, and the everyday commonplace Chester that he encountered in the rows. So it really is the quotidian, everyday, unremarkable, but old aspects of Chester that people are delighting on and really glorying in their descriptions of Chester. This might not seem wholly positive to all inhabitants of Chester, of course, but it's quite interesting to see that the civic and the business elite, as well as the antiquaries and the novelists, were actually becoming increasingly aware of Chester's historic environment for its economic benefit. The roads, for example, actually presented a very challenging asset. They're in need of constant repair. They were difficult of access. There were blurred lines of responsibility about who should actually keep the public steps clean. And were they actually suited? Were they actually practical for the present day? what we find is that in the Chester Archaeological Society, the membership includes many members of the business elite, including proprietors of business in the Rows. And the Archaeological Society is emphatic about the importance of preserving the Rows. The mayor provided an opening address to the society in 1850 and suggested that the inhabitants really need to be made to realise how much interest was taken in the city by foreigners and by Americans in particular. And had the society, he suggested, with its remit to preserve and restore and diffuse knowledge of history and antiquities, had the society existed 50 years earlier, far more of Chester's historic fabric would have been preserved to the admiration of our transatlantic brethren, and Chester would have rivaled Rome or Athens as a destination. In 1857, the Society published recommendations on the subject of domestic antiquities and deliberately attacked those who sought to destroy the quaint old features of Chester's defining characteristic and who were replacing them with uniform monstrosities in brick. Fellow citizens were warned that if Chester was to maintain its celebrity as one of the wonder cities of England and the economic benefits of tourism for hotels and tradesmen, it was essential to preserve what remained of the ancient attractions. Our quaint old rows, unique and picturesque as they certainly are, must not be idly sacrificed at Mammon's reckless shrine. So in branding city of Chester as a city of the past, American visitors were expressing one idea, this idea of jumping back into time, but the Chester Archaeological Society were embracing this idea of a city of the past not as a means of escaping the present, but as a means of future profit and prosperity. It was a source of pride and the basis of their modern 19th century identity as the best preserved historic town in the country. Now, after what I've said about York yesterday, you might think that York would have had something to say about that. And of course, today's York's stock of vernacular housing, exemplified in streets like the Shambles, is ruthlessly promoted on the city's tourist information website as the best preserved medieval shopping street in the world. I just find that a bizarre idea, a medieval shopping street. Anyway, discuss. Anyway, but in the 18th and 19th century histories and these kinds of buildings were practically invisible. It's not practically, entirely invisible. The narrative's always about the Roman city, about Alta Roma, it's about the cathedral. There's no interest at all. Now, Henry Cave in 1813 is illustrating these buildings. They're delightful engravings, beautiful. And there are a whole series of these vernacular domestic architecture with the distinctive gables and the highly ornamented plasterwork and the carving, and all recorded in beautiful detail. But Cave wasn't a fan. In his letterpress, he describes it as a barbarous mix of Gothic and Grecian, lacking simplicity and grace. But he did admit that, insofar as they went, they were good examples, but he didn't like it. And interestingly, for all that the guides of the first half of the 19th century were increasingly interested in the gatehouses, as we saw yesterday, they don't follow this through to discuss the vernacular architecture. And then in 1861, with Meeson's Railway Guide, the author notes the disappearance of buildings that earlier guides had never even mentioned. 50 years ago, every street in York afforded some interesting specimen of the domestic architecture of the 16th and 17th centuries, the visitor was told. But these have almost entirely disappeared. The overhanging and richly ornamented fronts have given place to plain, unornamented brickwork. So much of York's early modern heritage only became visible after it was destroyed. Because York's claim to olden time distinction lay principally in its cathedral, frequently claimed to be the finest specimen of Gothic in the country, and in the medieval gateways, the bars, Micklegate and Wolfenbar. This was York's claim. Chester had a cathedral built of red sandstone, which was eroding rapidly and couldn't claim equal distinction, and nor had the city retained any of its original gateways. So Chester's visual imagery took its lead from the picturesque peculiarity of a rose. In York, it was dominated by the bars and the minster. The domestic architecture of olden time was in effect discovered or invented in this period. It became ubiquitous in topographical imagery. But that didn't mean its survival was ensured. As Little John and many others pointed out, these buildings were dark, unhygienic, run-down, and had poor sanitation. They were the antithesis of improvement and modernity, and there are very powerful reasons to demolish them to make way for wider streets and buildings better suited to the demands of modern urban living. Charmingly picturesque as they were, the memory of such buildings and of olden time could still be preserved for those who are interested through the wealth of topographical art and latterly photographs. But the logic of rational improvement didn't always prevail. Historic buildings did have value that was being articulated with increasing clarity by those who sought to ensure their preservation. And it's to the subject of preservation of historic town that I'll come back to in the next and final lecture. Thank you.